Hello everyone, welcome back. This is Avorion episode 36. I'm Enigmius, and today we're continuing with the Serpovectem build. This episode completely free of profiling. We're doing everything except profile. We've got the front section of the ship. I decided that I wanted to start filling it in and kind of get a feel for how things were going to go with the rest of the build, because the challenges that we'll have to deal with on the front section of the build are basically going to be mirrored all the way back, top, bottom, front, back. It's all going to be similar in the way that we're going to have to approach things. One of the first things that I wanted to do was take a look at how we were going to transition this flat section on the side of the hull that we profiled and filled in a couple of episodes ago, so that everything comes together in a way that I'm happy with, is basically what it always boils down to. I prefer in most cases to have things come together seamlessly so that you can't really see any lines. It's just sort of all one uniform hull. But there are times when that's not necessarily practical, or the attempts that I make to make it that way aren't successful, and it takes me a little while to come up with a different idea that we could possibly make it work. And in the meantime, what I'll often do is just kind of go ahead with it anyways, except that maybe we're not going to be able to make it as seamless as we might like, and finish it off another way. And that way, if we don't come up with another idea, it's done. And if we do come up with another idea, usually the process of making it not seamless is not really all that time consuming. So it's not like we have a great deal of time that we wasted on something that we pull apart and redo. So this is sort of that version of it where I've tried to do it seamlessly, and it was kind of being a little bit cranky. It definitely didn't want to work. So I decided to go with an option that would be not seamless, but something that I'm pretty sure that I could live with if I had to. And it's not especially time consuming to assemble once I made the decision, so that if I do decide to change it later, I don't feel like I've wasted a bunch of time. This is one of those shapes where, even though we've done everything that I can think of to keep everything granular and keep everything based in the same sort of grid space so that things line up easily and we don't have to worry about... The one thing that I really wanted to avoid in doing this was those situations where you can't line things up because they're just off by a certain amount, and it's an amount that's smaller than the smallest amount that you can adjust the size of what you're working with. So you have to go back and rework things to, first of all, find where they went out of alignment, and then redo so that everything sort of comes together. I've been deliberately going out of my way to try and avoid that sort of a situation, being very, very careful that everything lines up the way that it's supposed to before we move on, before we find ourselves in a position where things don't line up. So we've done that. We've done as much as we can to get things to line up as best as possible. But again, this is one of those just sort of transitions where we're working with shapes and things that were created independently of one another. Even though they're all operating in the same grid space, it doesn't necessarily mean that the slope block that we have over here can be directly connected to a slope block that we have near it, because one might be a little bit longer than the other. Still the same grid space, but a little bit longer, a little bit shorter, and so we have to be a little bit creative in how we approach it in order to ensure that we get the shape and the end result that we're looking for. Here we've got a lot of those five-sided pyramids, and I say five-sided pyramid, hopefully it's the kind of thing that you can visualize. It's the one that's got a square base, and then it's got a triangular sort of wall on two sides, and then a sloped triangular wall on the other two sides, and that's the shape that we're working with. And I don't use it very often because it's one of those shapes that I've only found certain circumstances where it actually fits, and it seems to be a successful shape that allows us to do what we want. This is one of those rare circumstances where that ends up being the case, because it allows us to finish off a curved edge where it's curved along two planes and not have to worry about, you know, how it's going to connect to the next block or how it's going to connect to the blocks around it, because it's just sort of the terminus. It's at the very end of a particular profile that doesn't have to line up with other things. It just strikes me as kind of weird that there's a block like that it has such limited use in so many cases, but when it does work, it works really, really well. So the challenge for me is remembering that I even have access to it. It's one of those things, because I don't use it very often, it's very easy to forget that it's even an option, I found. But in this case, I was fortunate enough to remember, and it made the end result, like I say, not exactly necessarily what I would have liked it to be, but certainly much better than it would have been without this particular block, to kind of smooth things out and make the transition in a way that would be in line with sort of what I have in mind. So we're going to have a little bit of an overhang on the underside of the ship, where we've got this side piece sticking out a little bit. I may revisit it and try and do the seamless transition thing instead of what we're doing here. But like I say, if I don't get to that point, if I don't redo it, it's the kind of situation where I can look at it and say that I'm more or less satisfied with it. It doesn't have to be necessarily my first choice, as long as you know, I look at it and think, okay, that's not too bad. So we've got a certain amount of time being invested in this, just this little narrow strip working from the front around the side, so that we can work out this transition with that flattened side piece. It's a little bit fiddly and a little bit finicky for what we're getting out of it, mostly again because of the nature of the shapes and how everything is coming together, and sort of deciding out of the options that are available to me which ones are okay and which ones are just sort of not working at all. So we got that section done, that little narrow strip from the front of the ship all the way around to the side, and basically to the middle of the underside of that specific structural element. And then I started looking at how I would do this underside section of the hull. This is sort of the culmination of all the different curves that we've got going on. We've got the curve going around the side, we've got the curve going around underneath, and then we've also got the different lengths of blocks that went into making those curves, making it challenging to line everything up so that the end result, the final shape, when we have them connected, lines up the way that we would like it to. And I discovered after a certain amount of goofing around with it that we weren't going to be able to do everything seamlessly on the underside either. And it was simple enough once I made that decision that it wasn't going to work the way that I would like it to in my ideal situation, to kind of come up with an alternative that would be fairly straightforward. It would produce the kind of results that I could be happy with, and not require a whole lot of compromise, in the sense that I find myself constantly throughout the process making decisions out of, you know, the lesser of two evils. The first time that I went through this and decided that I wanted to try and basically just see how things went on their own, connecting things with the profiles that were already there, and if we couldn't make them connect on both ends, just kind of leave it and kind of roll with it, see what we ended up with. It was very, very lumpy, and it wasn't at all what I had in mind. And I kind of left it, and I kind of thought about it, and I looked at it the next day, and it was still lumpy, and I was still not necessarily happy with it. There's something to be said when we're looking at you know, a ship that's basically named after a snake, and looking at, you know, pictures of snakes in the real world, and not everything is smooth, not everything is flat. You know, there are different shapes, there's different muscles that come into play, and things are, you know, occasionally lumpy, and that's just the natural way of things. But in this example, I looked at it and it felt like a cop-out, because that's exactly what it was. It was just kind of rolling with the profiles that we had and seeing what we came up with, and in order to get everything to fit together, lumpy. So I ended up basically filling in this whole section of the hull from the front back to the side piece that we just built under, And I pulled it all out and started over, and this is what you're seeing now is the second attempt, and it's a little bit more informed about how things want to go if we let them, and it's also a little bit more lucid in the sense that I'm starting fresh on a new day. And previously, when I started putting it together, I had just done that side section that we showed at the beginning of the video, and then I moved on to this section, and I just, you start to get a little bit tired. You don't necessarily think as clearly as necessary to get everything done in line with what you have in mind. So sometimes that's all it takes is a bit of a rest. Go do something else, come back a different day, whatever, and we can come up with things that seem obvious when you're rested that don't seem so obvious when you're not. So this was not by any stretch of the imagination a super straightforward thing. You can see I'm removing a bunch of stuff here and replacing it, reworking a section that I just did, and it's learning as I go, sort of how we can make things fit together, the different options. There's always more than one way to do it, and that's kind of key, and something that I try and focus on to the point of being grossly repetitive is that there are different ways of doing things, and it's not necessarily a question of the right way versus all of the wrong ways. It's the way that I'm happy with versus the ways that I would not be happy with. And sometimes accepting things that are adequate is a better solution in terms of how I feel as someone who enjoys this process than constantly demanding that it has to be something that makes me very, very happy, and consequently not being happy a lot of the time, because it rarely works out exactly the way that I would like it to, especially when I was just starting out with this whole voxel building kind of thing. It's not about getting it perfect every single time, and it's certainly not about getting it perfect on the first try, but through kind of messing around and giving myself space to try different things, with the understanding that it doesn't have to be perfect and it doesn't have to be permanent, I can come up with different things that teach different lessons as I go. I learn a new technique, I learn a new method, I learn a new way of looking at things, and it just kind of builds up over time to the extent where we find more often than not, we get at least sort of within the ballpark of what we had in mind, or we feel confident that we're nowhere near the ballpark, and justified in making some changes and being able to make informed decisions about what those changes might be. It's just a thing. It's a process. And in this case, you can see this isn't a perfectly smooth, uniform curve sort of expanding as it goes along the underside of the ship. It's actually got a curve coming from the underside, and then it turns kind of abruptly. It's still seamless, but you can see that transition where it goes up a little bit on a steeper angle, and then it has another transition where it goes across at a lesser angle, and then it kind of meets up with the underside, and it's not even lining up seamlessly with the underside of the ship. But when I look at the profile from a number of different angles, you'll see quite often that I'm just kind of flipping around and looking from the front, or I'm looking from the side, or various different places. I feel like there's enough uniformity, there's enough of a theme that's working through this profile that I can say, yeah, I'm actually quite happy with that and the way that it's working out, even though it's got more going on than I had originally had in mind. It's not necessarily bad things. The difference here between what you see and what I had originally done is that sort of weird part where it changes direction and it goes up, and then it changes direction and it goes over again. I had that in the last iteration of it, but all of that stuff in between those changes, those transitions, that's where the angles just between different rows of blocks were wonky, and it made it look lumpy. That was basically the big difference. Is it's not a whole lot different in terms of the shape now, but it's not lumpy the way that it was before. So that's kind of a victory. And when I look at it, it is very much unintentionally, but very much in line with the underside of a snake's jaw and mouth, which is kind of cool. It's fun sometimes how that just works out the way that it does even though we weren't necessarily aiming for that much detail with regards to how it would look in, you know, the theme, in the context of the theme that we've decided for the build. So we're making good progress. The next episode we're going to continue on, probably do another episode just kind of filling in sections of the hull, getting things taken care of before we start doing a whole lot more profiling. In the last episode I mentioned that I would take those wings that we profiled and I would kind of redo them and refine them and just kind of get them a little bit more uniform looking, which I did. I'm not going to say it's 100% exactly where I would like it to be, but it's much better than it was before. And if I were to decide today that I wanted to just kind of start filling those in and making them permanent, I'm pretty certain that I would be happy with the overall profile. So may make some minor adjustments, we may not, but we'll be continuing with the build and trying to keep it moving forward in the next episode. And if you want to be notified about the next episode, the easiest way to do that is to subscribe to my channel or follow me on social media. Links for social media are always in the information section below the video. Feel free to leave your comments and feedback. Thanks for watching, guys, and take care.